traditional Punch and Judy show wouldn't get into E.N.S.A, I was determined that the new version would do the trick. This time, Punch was in battle dress and Judy was a member of the ATS. I turned the policeman into a red cap and the doctor became the MO. In place of the hangman, I made a puppet of Field Marshal Goring, complete with a breastful of medals, and the devil was replaced by Hitler himself. I rewrote the dialogue using army slang and military situations, and after rehearsing it for a week in Bob's kitchen, I was ready to do it before an audience. I picked on the Highland pub where Bob and I used to do our shows. The result was a riot. The soldiers in the bar roared with laughter, especially when Punch pulled a fast one on a superior officer. Afterwards, they gave me some ideas and hints that they knew would go down well with the boys. Once I'd made a few adjustments, I telephoned the E.N.S.A agent. This time, he showed more interest and offered to try the idea out in an army show that week. I turned up to find that a number of first-class acts and stars had been booked and the bill was somewhat overloaded. The agent asked me how long my act was. Oh, about 20 minutes, I told him. Cut it to 7, he said. You're 4th on. I couldn't think how I was going to do a 20-minute act in 7 minutes, and confided my worries in another fellow doing an audition. Well, you can't expect 20 minutes in a variety bill, he said. I've only got 4, and that's quite long enough for a hoofer. I knew that dancers never did long acts, but mine was different. Well, what's yours then? He asked. When I told him I was doing a Punch and Judy show, he burst out laughing. For a troupe show? The old man must have gone completely mad. You'll get the bird as soon as they see the thing on the stage. Ooh, the best of British luck. He went round telling the other artists, and I saw them sniggering and passing rude remarks. This completely put the damper on me. First, I had to cut my act, and now I was certain I was going to be a complete flop. I felt sick and wished I hadn't come. I wondered if I could pretend to be ill, but I knew the others would see through it and laugh all the more at my stage fright. There was nothing for it but to brave the thing out. I wouldn't be the first person who had ever been booed off the stage. So, doing my best to ignore the mirth around me, I built up the booth in the wings. Like an angel from heaven, Bob walked through the pass door. Oh, I've come to wish you luck. I know you'll be a success. I thanked him and wished I felt as confident as he looked. Was he saying it just to cheer me, or did he really believe it? If he did, he was the only one. When the 3rd act finished, I pushed the box to the center of the stage. Whether I imagined it or not, I thought the audience groaned when the compere uttered the words Punch and Judy. The curtain went up, and I bashed right into the show. The appearance of Punch in his army gear caused a guffaw, even from those in the wings who were only waiting for me to get booed off. Judy's entrance as an ATS got another laugh, and the appearance of a pretty girl in naffy uniform was greeted by wolf whistles. I worked as fast as I could, and there was terrific applause when Punch hanged Goring, which developed into frantic cheering when he killed Hitler, and twirled the body round on his stick as the pianist played There'll Always Be an England, or There'll Always Be a Scotland, as they call it up there. My burlesque had appealed to those boys who were going out to try and do in real life what I had done with puppets. And I took several curtain calls before the next act was able to go on. As I walked off the stage, the other performers patted me on the back. Even the dancer, who knew everything, had to admit he'd been wrong. The agent came through the pass door with a big grin on his face. Fine, boy, fine, he said. You can go out with a new troupe show I'm starting next week. Will I have longer time? I asked. No, keep it short, and keep it wanting more. I was delighted to find that this was the same show Bob had been engaged for. We toured Scotland for nearly a year, playing to troops from all over the British Isles. We used to be stationed in a town for a fortnight and picked up every evening by a coach, which took us to a different camp. The only people Punch didn't go down with were the RAF. The first show I did before them was a complete non-starter, and I walked off the stage to silence. I made another set of puppets with Punch in Air Force uniform, but although I usually got by after that, Punch was never as popular with the Air Force as he was with the Army. I think that Brill Creek boys thought themselves too sophisticated to be amused by what they considered a children's show. Or perhaps they thought I was taking the mickey and didn't like that. One day, we travelled to Aberdeen by train, and I'd left my luggage at the station for a few minutes while I had a cup of tea. That evening, when we arrived at the camp, I fixed up the booth as usual, and then opened the case to take out the puppets. Imagine my surprise when I found that the case was full of women's underclothes, sprinkled over with confetti. I realized at once that someone had taken my case by mistake, and that this case belonged to some honeymoon couple. I wonder what the bride thought when she found a set of Punch and Judy figures instead of her trousseau. Next day, I took the case down to the police station and explained what had happened. The sergeant in charge thought it was a huge joke. I expected to say them getting bored on their first night. He laughed. You must have given a good show with those bras and panties. The case was never claimed, and I never saw that set of figures again. Luckily I had a spare set, though they nearly went to a watery grave off one of the islands on the Forth. We travelled by drifter, and while the baggage was being unloaded, my case fell into the sea and sank. Fortunately, one of the soldiers was an expert frogman and rescued Mr. Punch and his friends. I managed to do the show, despite the fact that I had to work with soaking, wet puppets. After the Scottish tour, the show was transferred to England, where we carried on the same routine, doing the show every night. Bob left the show in Glasgow, as he didn't want to be too far away from his family. I heard that he was drafted into a factory, but I never saw him again. We arrived at Plymouth during the heavy bombing and spent a good deal of our time in air raid shelters. One afternoon I went to the cinema. The siren was moaning periodically, and people gradually left the building till only a handful was left. I knew I was just as safe in the cinema as I would be in my lodgings, and reckoned that if it was my time to die, I might just as well go on enjoying myself up to the last moment. The film ended, leaving me just enough time to go to my lodgings and fetch my gear before meeting the coach. I hurried back to find not a solid boarding house, but a heap of rubble. Punch and Co. had perished, like so many other victims of the Blitz. I felt very sorry that Mr. Punch had to go that way, especially as he was the present from Professor Smith, and over 100 years old. As I no longer had an act, I was sent back home. I set to work making a new set of puppets, and completed them within a month. I reported to the London headquarters of E.N.S.A. at Drury Lane Theatre, hoping they would send me out with another show, but this time I was unlucky. The London producers were more sophisticated than the Scots, and none of them could visualize a Punch and Judy show appealing to the forces. They couldn't understand how I'd got into the show in the first place. No matter how I argued, I couldn't make any headway. They insisted that I was a children's entertainer and wouldn't even give me a trial show. While in London, I did some shows in the underground stations, which were being used as air raid shelters. It certainly kept people's minds off the bombs that were falling outside, and I hope I also helped a little in keeping up the morale of the civilians. Before long, I returned to Glasgow and called to see the E.N.S.A. organizers there. This time, they sent me out on a sing-song party, which consisted of 4 people who travelled together in a van along with a mini piano and worked with searchlight and gun sights, performing to a handful of men. One day, the comedian of the show received his calling-up papers and had to leave. As comics were difficult to get, I had to take over from him. I didn't do badly, and many of the soldiers who weren't Scots said they liked me better than most Scottish comedians, as they could actually understand what I was saying. I toured Scotland with a sing-song party for over 6 months, doing both the Punch show and my comedy act. Then the organisation had the idea of sending some Scottish shows down to England, and our show was one of those chosen. So I returned to my homeland, this time in the guise of a Scottish comedian. We were all dressed up in kilts and sent to entertain the Canadian troops who were stationed in southern England. Most of the Canadians had, or claimed to have, Scottish ancestors, so they gave us a great welcome. From working in Scotland so long, I developed a slight accent and was hailed everywhere as a true Scot. One day, I received a letter from Drury Lane. I read that I was to leave the show and report to London. I was sorry to leave my friends, as we all got on so well, but I had to obey orders. When I arrived at the Lane, I was told that comedians were wanted in the Middle East, and I was to be sent overseas. They weren't interested in the puppet show, so for the time being, I had to say goodbye to Punch and Judy. By the end of the month, I was in Algiers, entertaining the troops with comedy songs and stories. I spent the rest of the war in the battle areas, but that's another story, and has nothing to do with Mr. Punch. In the meantime, the puppets were packed away in a shed in London, and despite the bombing, they were still there at the end of hostilities when I returned to continue my life where I'd left off. But when I opened the case, I found that only the heads could be used again. The bodies had made an excellent banquet for the moths. Once more, I had to start from scratch with a darning needle and a length of thread.